Hey everyone, and welcome to Travel Through Stories. My name is Sean, and today I want to talk about Oakley Hall's much-lauded 1958 novel, Warlock, here republished in 2006 by NYRB. The reason I was so drawn to this book is because I really like the idea of the Western genre. I don't really like too many Westerns, I haven't really read too many of them, but I really like the idea of the Western. And this mainly comes from my love of Cormac McCarthy, most emphatically Blood Meridian. But what I really like about Blood Meridian, and which led me to pick up Oakley Hall's Warlock as my next Western, is that both of these books are so interested in the myth of America, in American mythology. I'm always interested in how people mythologize their own history, how they use their history as a vehicle to create contemporary truths or ideals. If America has a mythology, I would argue that it is firmly grounded in two historical time periods. The first is the Revolutionary War. I mean, almost everything about the war and the men and women who fought in various ways in that war are mythologized. I mean, go listen to Hamilton to hear the latest mythologization of the founding of this country. The other time period, and this one I think is actually much more important to the American ethos, is the history of the Old West, of the time of the cowboys, the time of rugged men who are unabashed individualists, and they're usually just men. And this book, by the way, up front is no exception. There are exactly two female characters, one of whom very much typifies the Madonna stereotype. She's literally called the Angel of Warlock, and the other character really typifies the whore stereotype. She's literally a prostitute. And there's really nothing in between in terms of female characters. This book is very much interested in American masculinity. And so Oakley Hall is writing this in the 1950s and using the mythos of the Old West to explore both the history of America and his current contemporary cultural and political landscape. I'll come back to the contemporary political landscape that I think Oakley Hall is referencing. But suffice to say for now, I think there's a lot of Cold War politics and a lot of McCarthyism specifically in this book. I think he's really using the Old West to comment on politics and society in the 1950s. But what I think Oakley Hall is most interested in this book is in American mythology. And if you don't believe me, just read the blurb on the back of this NYRB edition, and you'll see a nice little quote by a certain Thomas Pynchon, who explains Tombstone, Arizona during the 1880s is, in ways, our national Camelot, a never-never land where American virtues are embodied in the Earps, and the opposite evils in the Clanton gang, where the confrontation at the OK Corral take on some of the dry purity of the Arthurian joust. And then just a little bit later, he writes, "It is the deep sensitivity to abysses that makes Warlock one of the best American novels. For we are a nation that can, many of us, toss with all aplomb our candy wrapper into the Grand Canyon itself, snap a color shot and drive away. And we need voices like Oakley Hall's to remind us how far that piece of paper, still fluttering brightly behind us, has to fall." As Pynchon alludes to in that excerpt, Warlock is very much based on the historical town of Tombstone, Arizona, which was the so-called last boom town of the American frontier. Tombstone, like Warlock, is very much a mining town. There was a large silver deposit nearby. But what the town of Tombstone, Arizona is most famous for is this shootout at this place called the OK Corral between this U.S. Marshal named Virgil Arp, I'm not sure how to pronounce it, and this gang of outlaws who call themselves by this very original name, the Cowboys. This shootout was the culmination of a very long-standing feud between many of the townsfolk of Tombstone, Arizona, and this band of outlaws. And this general feud is exactly what Warlock is all about. Hall isn't subtle about drawing from history, and in fact, in the prefatory note of this book, he acknowledges this. And he writes, "The fabric of the story, too, is made up of actual events interwoven with invented ones. By combining what did happen with what might have happened, I have tried to show what should have happened. Devotees of Western legend may consequently complain that I have used familiar elements to construct a fanciful design, and that I have rearranged or ignored the accepted facts. So I will reiterate that this work is a novel. The pursuit of truth, not of facts, is the business of fiction." And I just love that last line. That's such a nice way of describing what fiction really does. It gets at the truth behind the facts. This book opens with the deputy of Warlock being run out of town by a certain Abe McQuone, who is this outlaw figure. The townspeople, especially the Citizens Committee, which is this group of bureaucrats in the town whom we hear from quite a bit, they are obviously not too happy with this, and they don't want to be overrun by this band of outlaws. So they bring in this famous gunslinger from Texas, Clay Blaisdell, to act as the marshal of the town and to protect them from Abe McQuone and his band of cowboys. And so right off the bat, we see this town that is booming in a way economically, as again, it's very similar to Tombstone, where there's a mine nearby with a large silver deposit. But the larger social structures within this town are failing its own citizens. In fact, like most Westerns, there isn't really a strong legal system. There is a legal system, but it's so fragile that strong men can take it over, right? We just saw Abe McQuone run out the deputy. So to stop the bad strongman, Abe McQuone, the Citizens Committee decide to bring in a good strongman, Clay Blaisdell. And these two characters are these just larger-than-life mythological figures who are drawn out of myth as much as they are out of history. And they're placed in Warlock in diametrical opposition. And you can probably see where this is going. But what I found so interesting about these two nemeses is that Clay Blaisdell, the hero, and Abe McQuone, the villain, aren't necessarily similar, but they both expose the exact same problems with the town. That is, Clay Blaisdell is a big, tough gunslinger who is brought in to get rid of this other big, tough gunslinger, McQuone. To reach my Beowulf reference quota for the month, Warlock is like Heorot, and it is being attacked by this outside force like Grendel in the shape of Abe McQuone, and they need to bring in a hero, a Beowulf, to stop this from happening. And this is all well and good, at least for now. I mean, go read Wealhtheow's speech to Beowulf after Beowulf defeats Grendel. Trading out one strong man for another doesn't guarantee the safety of the townspeople. And in fact, the judge of Warlock, Judge Holloway, realizes this quite early on. And he explains, in a rather crass way, that bringing in Blaisdell to take care of McQuone won't actually solve the fundamental problems that this town is experiencing, as vigilantism is never a permanent solution. Any man, the judge said, and paused for their attention. Any man, he went on, who has got himself set over others and don't have any responsibility to something bigger than him is a son of a bitch. He stared from face to face, his cheek twisting around the great wart, his mouth drawn out, flat and contemptuous. Bigger than all men, he said, which is the law. And in fact, Judge Holloway and Blaisdell butt heads time and time again, as Judge Holloway often works to temper the ego of gunslinger come Marshal Clay Blaisdell. Not too far into this book, and without spoiling anything, somebody robs this stagecoach just outside of Warlock. And so Blaisdell works to gather a band of vigilantes to go investigate this and hunt down whoever did this. But the judge comes into the jail where Blaisdell is gathering his men and confronts Blaisdell directly. And he asks Blaisdell, "Who are you, Clay Blaisdell or the Marshal of Warlock?" To which Blaisdell responds, "Why, both, Judge," Blaisdell said. "A man is bound by what he is," the judge said. "An honest man, I mean. I am asking whether you are bound by being Marshal or being Clay Blaisdell." "Both, I expect." "Judge, I don't just know for sure what you are which first," the judge snapped. This time Blaisdell didn't answer. "Oh, I know what you are thinking. You think I am a drunk, one-legged old galoot pestering you, and you are too polite to say so. Well, I know what I am, Mr. Marshal Blaisdell, or Mr. Clay Blaisdell, that is incidentally Marshal of Warlock. But I want to know which you are." "Why?" Blaisdell said. "Why? Well, I got to thinking, and it seems to me the trouble in a thing like law and order is there is people working every which way at it or against it. Like it or not, there has got to be people in it. But the trouble is, you never know what a man is. So how can you know what he is going to do? So I thought, why not ask straight out? I asked Johnny Gannon here, just now, what he was and where he stood, and he told me. Are you any better than another, that you shouldn't?" Blaisdell still did not speak. He looked as though he had just dismissed the judge's words as idle and was thinking of something else. And this is just one of the many confrontations between these two men. And again, I really think this actually mirrors Beowulf quite nicely. I mean, go read the feast scenes after Beowulf defeats Grendel. I mean, the first thing that the people of Heorot want to do, or at least Wealhtheow, who is Hrothgar's wife, as she is by far the more politically savvy of the two, the king and the queen, go read Wealhtheow's speech to Beowulf. She wants to do two things. One is give Beowulf a few gifts to make him happy. And then two, get Beowulf the hell out of Heorot. A hall that is so weak that it needed to bring in an external hero is, well, ripe to be conquered by that hero. And it seems that here in Warlock, the judge is also aware of this problem, though Clay Blaisdell doesn't pose an active threat to Warlock. He does, though, by his very existence, expose a fundamental problem with this town. And this really gets at how Hall is playing with American mythology. Clay Blaisdell is in many ways the personification of the masculine, gunslinging cowboy hero of the Old West. He's strong, he's an individualist, he's bearded, he's pretty noble, etc. But what this book shows, I think, is that a single man can't hold together the fabric of an entire town. In the eyes of Judge Holloway, even the heroes need to be responsible to something greater, some sort of greater structure, because when they aren't and they don't have these checks and balances, well, occasionally they get too trigger happy. And a large part of this problem for Blaisdell comes in the form of the other characters that he surrounds himself with. Two main characters in particular. One is named Tom Morgan, who is a sort of gambler and drinker, but he's Blaisdell's friend and is therefore put into a position of power. And we also have Bud Gannon, who is a pretty noble figure, but he used to run with McQuone, and his brother still runs with McQuone, so his loyalties are fraught. And it's here where this book is the most fun, and it's here where it explores very much the ethos of the American West. As we get all of these just amazing characters on both sides of the feud, and they're all incredibly nuanced and round. I won't go into too much detail here for the sake of time, but Gannon and Morgan, for my money, are by far the two most interesting characters in this novel, as they're constantly negotiating these different power structures of the town. And it's really in this characterization that I think Warlock is so effective. While the general structure of this novel looks like it's a simple feud between good and evil, between good town marshal and evil outlaw, it's a lot more complicated and nuanced than that. And to just read it as a simple good versus evil struggle would be a disservice to the novel, in a similar way to reading Beowulf as simple hero, good hero defeats bad monsters is an incredible disservice to an otherwise very complicated and nuanced poem. And in the background of all of this, just behind our main actors, is this subplot about the town miners attempting to unionize. And I won't really get into it here, but there is in this book, I think, a pretty overt critique of capitalism. I mean, any sort of critique of rugged individualism is in some way critique of American capitalism, because the latter is dependent on the former. But Hall really does seem to be using this subplot of the town miners attempting to unionize to not really just comment on 1880s America, but really to comment on his contemporary 1950s America. I want to talk a little bit about the structure of this novel, as I think it's doing a lot of really interesting things, and it sort of reveals how this book so effectively explores the sociological impact of this central feud. So probably like 3/4 of this book is told in more or less direct third-person narration, where each chapter we usually focus on a single character or a group of characters. But about 1/4 of this book or so is told through the diary entries of a certain Henry Holmes Goodpasture, who is on the citizens committee of the town, but he, in his diary entries, reflects on the actions and events of this book. Often something will happen, and then we'll get a chapter that is a diary entry in which Goodpasture will think about the ramifications or the perception of the events that just happened. But I thought this was a really effective way to structure this book, as again, it offers this sociological approach to this story, as Goodpasture sort of speaks for the town of Warlock more generally. He sort of acts as the social consciousness of the town. It reminded me a bit, actually, of the first third of Cormac McCarthy's Child of God, as not only do we get the actions, the events themselves, but we get this reflection of those same events. And by doing this, we have this inherent focus on storytelling, of history writing, of mythologizing, as Goodpaster is quite literally writing the history of the town as it happens, as the events happen. The journal that he writes is the very type of source that a historian would pick up and use to rewrite and recreate the history of this town. Or it's the sort of thing that a literary-minded person would pick up and use to rewrite this history. I mean, just look at what Cormac McCarthy did with Samuel Chamberlain's My Confessions. In fact, Goodpaster actually writes at one point, "The human animal is set apart from other beasts by his infinite capacity for creating fictions," which is just a great line. So this book is very interested in retelling these legends, in retelling these myths, and is interested in the power that these stories hold on the collective consciousness of America, especially in the 1950s when Oakley Hall is writing this book. But I think that many of these interests remain relevant to this day. I think this book is really about what happens to a society when strong men rule that society, where there aren't proper systems in place to temper that power. It's definitely not a stretch to postulate that Oakley Hall, when writing this novel, was aware and interested in his contemporary politics. And I think most explicitly what we see in this book is in some ways a commentary on the effects of McCarthyism. Now, this doesn't map on perfectly because this book isn't an allegory by any means, but I think this book is very interested in the idea of power vacuums that are created when you give a single man the power to do whatever they want. McCarthyism is really the product of giving a single man all the power in the world to make his own demagogic attacks on whomever he wants. McCarthyism proved that a community's desire to have a hero is almost as large as its desire to have a villain. What I'm getting at here is that Warlock is very interested in the faulty systems, the downright broken systems that lead to things like McCarthyism, that lead to things like giving powerful or rich people all the power in the world. There's a great line towards the end that just says, "It was a sad truth that all the masses of men in their causes would be led by ambitious men, by power-hungry, cunningly self-serving men, rather than by the humanists, the idealists." Like in the 1950s when this book was being written, and honestly, like still in the 2020s when I'm reading this book, the political and cultural landscape of America is one that is fractured, weak, and ready to be taken advantage of by ultra rich or very powerful people. That is, if it's not already being taken advantage of. That is, the town of Warlock, much like America, is fundamentally built upon a myth that can crumble down and break down just as easily as it was constructed. Warlock plays with this American mythology, deconstructing it and reconstructing it in a very similar way to what Cormac McCarthy does in Blood Meridian and in his Border trilogy. But what I like so much about Warlock is how it really focuses in on the nuanced morality of every single one of the characters and how that affects how that is affected by the larger society in which they operate. I've come to expect types and tropes from Westerns, from the Western genre. But this book really offers, I think, a careful critique of those types and tropes, for the most part, not with the female characters, with the male characters. But by doing so, it really undermines the myths that these types and tropes are built upon. And let me just end on a quote from the last pages of the novel. "Is not the history of the world no more than a record of violence and death cut in stone? It is a terrible, lonely, loveless thing to know it, and see, as I realize now the doctor saw before me, that the only justification is in the attempt, not in the achievement, for there is no achievement, to know that each day may dawn fair or fairer than the last, and end as horribly wretched or more. Can those things that drive men to their ends be ever stilled, or will they only thrive and grow, and yet more hideously clash one against the other, so long as man himself is not stilled? Can I look out at these cold stars in this black sky, and believe in my heart of hearts that it was this sky that hung over Bethlehem, and that a star such as these stars glittered there to raise men's hearts to false hopes forever? This is the sky of Gethsemane, and that of Bethlehem has vanished with its star. Thanks for watching.